Let's take a look at another necessary assumption question, starting with the question stem. Assumption required. Assumption required by the argument. That's how we know this is a necessary assumption question. The stimulus says reducing class sizes in our school district would require hiring more teachers. All right, so the first sentence tells you that if you want to reduce class sizes, you have to hire more teachers. You might have to do other things as well. But here's one thing that you must do: hire more teachers. Okay? That does accord with our common sense understanding of how to reduce class size, right? You have 20 kids in a class. If you want to make it 10 kids to a class, well, you got to hire an extra teacher. Okay, but I want you to focus on the necessity of it. The educator is saying that if you want to accomplish this, you must do this. Okay? However, there is already a shortage of qualified teachers in the region. Although students receive more individualized instruction when classes are smaller, education suffers when teachers are underqualified. Okay, therefore, reducing class sizes in our district will probably not improve overall student achievement. So here you have a very clear conclusion indicator, but there's also all sorts of other indicators as well, right? So we need to, before even turning to the specifics of, this is a necessary assumption question, let's just make sure we understand the argument. Okay, so therefore indicates conclusion for sure. What do we do with although? Although sets aside claims that are not, strictly speaking, part of the argument because it doesn't support your conclusion. When you say although, you're saying, I will concede this point, which may in fact hurt my argument. That's although, right? That's in spite of the fact, or despite. Those words work to introduce what I call concession points, right? You're conceding this to your, pretend you have some opponent, right, who's trying to argue against you. You're conceding, right? You're conceding the point away. You're saying, yes, you're right. Of course, students receive more individualized instruction when classes are smaller. That's a positive for the students. But here's the thing I really want to focus on, right? Here's my premise. Education suffers. That's a negative when teachers are underqualified, right? So here's at least one premise for the conclusion. There are more premises. Yes. Starting with the however, right? This is where you do have a context switch over to the argument premise, right? And by the way, this switch over from context to argument, I don't want you to think that the information in the context is not relevant. It absolutely is relevant. We'll get to that in a second, right? But first, let's focus on this. We're saying there already is a shortage of qualified teachers in the region, right? We already have a shortage of qualified teachers in the region, and education will suffer when you hire someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Therefore, conclusion is, these two premises supporting the conclusion, reducing class sizes in our district. Do you see how the context is now super relevant? Because the context tells you a necessary condition of reducing class sizes in the district. The necessary condition is that you have to hire more teachers. That's what kicks everything off. You see, the conclusion says, look, if we're going to reduce class sizes in our region, the first thing you got to do is you got to hire more teachers. Is that going to be an issue? Well, maybe, right? Because there already is a shortage of qualified teachers. If you hire underqualified teachers, education is going to suffer. That's why the conclusion says our district will probably not improve overall student achievement. Now we understand the argument. Is it a good argument? I mean, like most arguments in logical reasoning, it's a okay argument, right? There is some support flowing from the premises to the conclusion. Is it a great argument? I don't think so. I see some holes already. I'm sure you probably see one or two holes too. And now the correct answer choice is going to exploit the existence of these gaps, right? Of these holes in the reasoning. In other words, assumptions that the argument has made. Did you spot any assumptions? One thing that I thought was fairly repetitive, because, well, it is repetitive, is this idea of doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? Like a cost-benefit analysis where there's some downsides, but there's some upsides, and then they talk about in the aggregate, but they don't actually tell you which outweighs what, right? It's like, should I eat this apple? I really like the taste of the apple. That's a plus. But I really don't like the texture of the apple. It makes my skin crawl. So that's a minus. Well, so overall, I shouldn't eat the apple. Well, hold on a second. I mean, there you just assume that the negative from the texture outweighs the positive from the taste. You didn't say that. You just assumed it, right? And something similar is happening here. The educator conceded the point that, look, when you reduce a class size from 20 students to 10 each, the class is going to be smaller, and therefore each student will receive more individualized instruction. That's a plus. On the other side, if the new teacher that you hire is underqualified, yeah, they're going to suffer, so that's a minus. But which of these factors weighs more, right? Which of the factors will swallow the other factor? We don't know. We're assuming that the negative weighs more than the positive. That's definitely an assumption that's required. Turns out, it's not in the answer choices. Why not? Because it's not the only assumption that's required. There may be other, in fact, there are other assumptions that are also required. And this is, the LSAT writers have what? Weeks and months of time to spend sitting around thinking about the logic of this argument, discussing with each other the logic of the argument. They construct these puzzles. They place gaps for you to identify only to not utilize it, because this is a great way to hide some other gap. Okay? So knowing that this is how the LSAT writers operate, and by the way, hopefully what I just said sounded familiar, because by no means is this specific to necessary assumption questions, right? They do this all the time. They give you multiple assumptions, multiple gaps in an argument, whether it's for weakening or strengthening, right? To distract you, so that they can generate some answer choice that pretends to talk about this thing that you spotted. So knowing that that's what they do, what's your response? Well, one response you should have when the clock is ticking, in other words, when you're doing a prep test, is you shouldn't spend too much time trying to identify all the gaps in the argument, precisely for the reason that you might be led down false trails. Okay, so in other words, use process of elimination. Look at the answers. See if the answers are talking about gaps that are present in the argument. That's when the clock is ticking. But during blind review, you have to sit here with this stimulus and do the best job you can of identifying all the gaps. In other words, during blind review, I'm asking you to think like the test writers. Because the more you do that, the quicker and quicker you will be during timed runs of identifying all those gaps. Right? Imagine you do this blind review and you do it for every question where they give you an argument, there are multiple assumptions, you come up with all the assumptions. How can you not get better, even under time pressure? I mean, of course you're going to get better under time pressure. So the next time you come across a question like this, even under time pressure, you might just be able to rattle off all the assumptions. That would be amazing, right? But what I'm saying is when the clock is already ticking, when you're already taking a prep test or on test day, if these assumptions aren't just popping out at you, you cannot afford to sit there and try to make them appear. Right? You have to look at the answer choices and utilize process of elimination. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. I mean, really the difference in strategy reflects the difference in what you're doing. Are you taking the test or are you studying for the test? All right, so we're studying for this test. Let's identify other gaps in this argument. Okay, so the gap that I already talked about, this cost-benefit analysis where you have a plus factor, a negative factor, and then they don't actually tell you the weights, but you just assume that when you add them up, one of them is heavier than the other. One of them outweighs the other. Okay, so that's pretty common. You're going to see this in other questions, and in those other questions, that in fact will be the key issue. Okay, but here, let's look again at our argument. Context says, if you want to reduce class size, you have to hire more teachers, presumably qualified teachers. Can you hire more qualified teachers? Well, they tell you that there's already a shortage of qualified teachers in the region. So let's think about this, right? There's a shortage of qualified teachers in this region. Okay, I understand what that means. I'm in the New York region. There's a shortage of qualified teachers in my region. Can I hire more qualified teachers? Maybe. Probably not from my region, but maybe from a neighboring region. Or how about across the country from California? Maybe California has qualified teachers. So do you see what the gap is here between what the premise says about there already is a shortage of qualified teachers in the region versus what the argument actually needs, which is that you cannot hire more qualified teachers. What the argument needs is that if you do more teacher hiring, you're going to have to hire underqualified teachers. That's how they get to their conclusion that therefore, if you reduce your class size, right, reduce your class size means you have to hire more teachers. Hire more teachers means you have to hire more underqualified teachers. You wouldn't improve overall student achievement. But that's a gap. Just because there's a shortage of qualified teachers in the region doesn't mean there's a shortage of qualified teachers everywhere in the world. That's the second gap. Okay, with that said, let's once again look at the answers, and E first, because E is the right answer. It says qualified teachers could not be persuaded to relocate in significant numbers to the educators' region to take teaching jobs. That has to be assumed because E precisely identifies the second gap in the argument, the second assumption. Just because there's a shortage of qualified teachers in our region doesn't mean that you have to hire underqualified teachers. Why can't you hire qualified teachers from a different region? Framed as a weakening answer choice, that's exactly what you would say. You would say that, well, actually, there are tons of qualified teachers in neighboring regions that are willing to come and move to your region. But we're not in weakening, right? We're in strengthening, superset strengthening, subset necessary assumption. In necessary assumption, you have to defend this argument. This question, like the previous question we saw, is giving us an answer choice, a necessary assumption that defends the argument, that protects the argument, that allows the argument to still run through. Notice it doesn't help the argument by a lot, right? Like E is true. Qualified teachers could not be persuaded to relocate in significant numbers to the educator region to take teaching jobs. Fine, that's true, right? Does that mean this conclusion follows logically? No, right? Because you still then have to struggle with this accounting issue, right? Like which of these factors weighs more? Such is the nature of necessary assumption questions. They're not meant to make the argument just run through completely like we saw in sufficient assumption or PSA questions, right? They're merely meant to protect the argument, right? But look at how devastating it would be if you negated answer choice E. Let's say qualified teachers could now be persuaded, right? In droves, teachers from California are just going to move to New York, to our region. Well, then, look, your argument falls apart. Sure, there's a shortage of qualified teachers in New York, but who cares now, right? Because busloads of qualified teachers from California are going to come through, right? So then you see how this doesn't even matter. Oh, students receive more individualized instruction when classes are smart. Okay, that's a plus. But education suffers when teachers aren't underqualified. Wait, but this is now irrelevant because we have qualified teachers from California coming. So this doesn't even do anything anymore. So what do you mean, therefore, reducing class size would probably not improve? It seems like quite the opposite. It seems like we have very good reason to believe that reducing class size by splitting classes up and having those qualified California teachers lead the new classes would in fact end up in improvement in overall student achievement. That's devastating for the argument, right? The negation of a truly necessary, required assumption, the negation of it will prevent the existing premises from supporting the conclusion, destroying the argument, in other words. Let's now take a look at answer choice D, and the presence of D, in addition to the presence of answer choice A, which we're going to look at next, I think is what makes this question really hard. Okay, because I feel like if they swapped out D for a more obviously wrong answer and did the same for answer choice A as well, I don't think this question will be too hard because you will look at answer choice E having just breezed through the other answers. You get to answer choice E, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's right. What about the teachers from California? I hadn't thought of that. But you see, it's the presence of these other answer choices, D, I think, in particular, that distracts you, that makes you think, maybe this is the issue, maybe this isn't the issue, right? Surely this sounds like it's the issue. Okay, so this is just to illustrate the point that this is how the outside writers modulate the difficulty of a question. They can do it in the stimulus by making the stimulus super difficult to understand, right? Sometimes that's how they do it. Here, they're dialing up the difficulty in the answer choices. D, in fact, strengthens the argument. If most or all of the teachers hired were underqualified, which is precisely what the educator is contemplating, right? That's the educator's worry. Educator says there's already a shortage of qualified teachers, presuming that if we hire more teachers, most or all of them will be underqualified. And then he says, look, underqualified means education suffers, and that's why I conclude it's not going to improve overall student achievement, right? That's the line of reasoning. So if it's true that if most or all of the newly hired teachers were underqualified, then that campaign of hiring more teachers wouldn't improve achievement of any student, not a single one, then yeah, this argument is greatly strengthened. Okay, so if the question stem were not this necessary assumption subset of the strengthening superset questions, if it was just a straight up strengthening question, then both D and E would be right. But we are looking at a necessary assumption question, and D is just not necessary, right? It's just not necessary. It's too much. Look at our conclusion. Are we trying to say that not a single student will improve? That's not what we're trying to prove. That's not what the educator is trying to argue to. The educator is trying to argue to overall improvement, right? Notice that it's overall improvement, and it's a probabilistic conclusion. Two key distinguishing features. This is not probabilistic, it's definite, and this is not about overall like the conclusion is. This is about each and every single one of the students. Surely if this is true, then this is true. But in order for this to be true, we don't need this to be true, right? I'll say that again. Surely if it's definite that every single student's not going to improve, then okay, probably you're not going to get overall improvement. That's kind of like putting it mildly, right? But if my standard is lower, if all I need to do is show that, oh, probably you're going to get some overall downswing, you don't have to take it to this extreme. You see what I'm saying? Like, if I just need a hunting rifle, you don't have to call in a tank. So that was my attempt to explain why, in order for this argument to run, we don't need a D. Now, of course, there is this other way to see it, which is if you negate answer choice D, can our argument still stand? And the answer is yes. Difficulty is, how do you negate answer choice D? Notice D is a conditional claim. If A, then B, right? If A, then B. Now you gotta recall the theory on how to negate conditional claims. If A, then B negates to A and not B, right? A and not B. So the A here would be most or all of the teachers hired were underqualified. That's exactly what the educator is contemplating, that because there's a shortage of qualified teachers in the region, that if we hire teachers, most or all of them are going to be underqualified. Negation says not B. It's not the case that hiring would not improve the achievement of any student in the school district, right? A lot of negations here. There's two negations, right? It's not the case that I see a not, that's two nots, and then I see this any. How do I deal with this? Well, maybe we can get rid of this negation first, right? What's the original claim here? Hiring teachers will not improve any student achievement. That means hiring teachers would improve how many students' achievements? 1? No. 5? No, right? They're saying it would not improve achievement of any student. So if I want to say it in the positive version, I want to drop this not, in other words. What do I have to do to this any? I have to change it to none. 0, right? 0. That's the original claim. Hiring teachers would not improve achievement of any student. You could have just said hiring teachers would improve the achievement of exactly 0 students in the school. Great. I've now stumbled upon the logical equivalent statement of B, right? The original version B, logical equivalent. The benefit of this version is that it doesn't come with a negation. Now it's easy to negate it. Oh, it's not the case that we would improve 0 students. Okay, well, that's a lot of possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that we could improve 1, right? That's not the case that you improve 0, you improve 1. Another possibility, you improve 2. Another is you improve 50. Another is that you improve all, right? That's the negative version of this first clause. So the full negation of answer choice D, the full negation of A arrow B is A and not B, meaning most or all of the teachers we hired were underqualified, and you still see improvement in like 2 or 1 or 10 of the students. The educator will look at that and be like, okay, but you see my concern still stands, right? Because I was merely trying to say that probably will not improve overall student achievement. What does it prove that you've shown me that we can help 1 or 3 or 10 students? Nothing. It proves nothing. The conclusion could still follow from the premises. Very different from the effect that negating answer choice E had on the argument. Now let's take a look at answer choice A, which is the second most popular wrong answer choice. But I have a feeling that since you guys have been diligent in paying attention to the lessons in this logical reasoning mini course, A is going to be a super easy eliminate for you, right? Because of what? One word in answer choice A. It's something we've seen before. Logical reasoning is very repetitive. Wrong answers are repetitive. They use the same tricks to generate the same wrong answers. They merely look different. What's the word here? Should. This is a prescriptive claim. We are looking at a descriptive argument. The educator is merely evaluating the situation. You want to reduce class sizes? Okay, you have to hire more teachers. Look around. Are there a lot of qualified teachers? No, in our region, there's a shortage. Now we weigh the costs and the benefits. The benefit is that smaller classrooms, more individualized The cost, well, you got underqualified teachers. Obviously, they're not going to do a great job. Okay, in aggregate, then I'm going to project that reducing class size probably will not improve overall student achievement. Should we reduce class size? Should we not reduce class size? Those are value-laden claims. They're prescriptive claims. The educator is going to say, I don't know. I didn't contemplate any of those things. Maybe you should reduce class size anyway, even though you wouldn't receive overall improvement in student achievement. You know why? Because for whatever bizarre reason, social distancing is really important. It's in fact far more important than student achievement in this moment. So, well then, okay, in spite of the fact that students are going to suffer educationally, you maybe should still reduce class size. Do you see, like, that's the stark spotlighting of why these should claims just have no place when you are dealing with just a descriptive argument. You don't know what the values are, right? You don't know why they're talking about this. There really is no clue about like why they're talking about this, right? Maybe it's budget reasons. Who knows? Could be anything, right? So that's the issue. Now, of course, A isn't completely untethered to the argument. It's not like A is talking about cats and dogs, right? I mean, you see this word school district, you see overall achievement. So that's how they're trying to get you to be like, well, I'm just going to take some of the same words and mash them together, word salad over here. Pay attention to me, right? But I want you to think about what is the relationship between A and the argument. If you can formulate a very clear picture of what the actual relationship is between A and the argument, I think that's going to help you see how this clear picture of the real relationship looks nothing like the relationship that the question stem is setting out. In other words, necessary assumption. You see, the relationship between A and the argument is that if the conclusion does follow from the premise, in other words, if it's true that reducing class size wouldn't improve overall student achievement, and then A tells you class size should be reduced only if it would reduce overall student achievement, then you can draw the further conclusion, right, that answer choice A plus this statement, these two things together allows you to draw the further conclusion that probably we shouldn't try to reduce class size, right? Notice I use the word should. It's prescriptive because we have a prescriptive. I'm using A now as a premise. Right there, I've done, what we do in MSS questions. You take two claims together and you see, does anything fall out of them? Yeah, A and this claim together, you can have a conclusion fall out of it. Okay, but that's not this. It's not a necessary assumption. Answer choice B is very similar to D. So if you haven't had a chance yet, I highly recommend that you do to B what we did to D, which is to say identify that it is conditional and then run the negation and translate all of it into English. Okay, so I'll do it now. If class sizes were reduced, there's your A, then at least some qualified teachers would be able to improve overall achievement of students in their class. There's your B. Negated, A and not B. What does that mean? Class sizes are reduced and it's not the case that, remember, you just use this, right? It's not the case that at least some qualified teachers can improve overall achievement of their class. What's the negation of at least some? 0, right? In its original form. You see, in this way, we're kind of just doing the opposite of what we did for D. D negated 0. We ended up with some. B is negating some. We're going to end up with 0. In its original version, it said that at least some teachers, like at least one, right? Or maybe 2, or maybe 5, at least some of them are going to be able to improve. If you say no to that, you're saying not no to 5, no to 2, no to 1. In other words, you're saying exactly 0 teachers will improve. Okay, so the negative version of this answer choice says class sizes have been reduced and exactly 0 teachers improve the overall achievement of students in their class. Well, that's exactly in line with this conclusion. In other words, the negation of answer choice B helps the argument. That's weird. That's not how it's supposed to be. For necessary assumptions, the negation of an answer choice is supposed to destroy an argument, not help bolster it. And lastly, answer choice C says students place a greater value on having qualified teachers than on having smaller classes. C is trying to distract you. It's trying to change the conversation. Oh, wait, but what about what the students think? Yeah, nobody cares what the students think, right? I sound like an asshole for saying that, but it's true. Look at the educator's argument again. Is there any room in this argument for what the students think? No. Is there any room in the argument, for that matter, for what parents think? No. There isn't even any room in this argument for what the teachers think. Why don't you ask the teachers? What do they prefer? Oh yeah, that's right. I don't give a shit about their preferences because I'm merely making a descriptive argument. You want to reduce the class size? You have to hire more teachers. We don't have enough qualified teachers in our region. Here's a plus of smaller class size, but here's a minus when you have to have underqualified teachers. Therefore, in the aggregate, reducing class size is probably going to cost us in overall student achievement. Where in this argument do we make space for, oh, but how do the students feel about this? Did you consult them? What if you hurt their feelings? How are the teachers going to feel if you make them work with colleagues that they think are under, or if you cut their class size by half, they're probably going to be happy about that, but all of that is not relevant. Yet again, just like the previous question, you see the presence of these kinds of answer choices, distractions. You're barely holding on to the thread of what is relevant. C comes along, hey, pay attention to this thing over here. Have you thought about this? It's very important to protect yourself, to inoculate yourself against answer choices like C. They exist. There are lots of answer choices like C. We saw 2 of them in the previous question. Right, here's one of them again. You inoculate yourself against an answer like this by truly understanding the argument to begin with before you look at the answer choices. If I haven't already said this, I'll say this now. The answer choices are not your friends. Each and every single one of them wants to hurt you. The wrong ones want to fool you into thinking they're the right ones or distract you from what is actually relevant. And the right one is trying to fool you into overlooking it. Oh, don't look over here. I'm not saying anything important. And, look at these other answer choices. Your only friend in the logical reasoning section is the stimulus. Make sure you understand the stimulus.